Welcome to the Badass Active Bystander Intervention Training for Social Hosts. This is one of the required trainings for you to be able to live off campus. And my name is Chris Walters. I'm a health educator in the Wellness Resource Center.
My name is Montana Bass. I'm one of the paraprofs in the Wellness Resource Center.
And I'm Celia Palmer, and I'm the other paraprof in the Wellness Resource Center.
So the reason why this is part of the off-campus training is because a lot of the social scene at CC occurs in houses off campus. And now that you're all trying to live off campus, you have a lot of freedom, but also a lot of responsibility to create environments that are inclusive, consent-oriented, and trauma-informed. All values of living in the CC community. And you can think of these spaces that you'll be creating, whether they're big parties or smaller social gatherings, or even just if you're a party goer yourself, you can think of these spaces as extensions of the CC community. So we're going to talk today about what it means to be a social host, what are the responsibilities that you have in creating spaces, how you can identify potential issues in your space as they arise, and how you can handle them as a social host. And a lot of these things, if you have taken the Badass Active Bystander training, will sound very familiar. We're going to talk about being aware of specific behaviors and situations. We're going to talk about the responsibility that you have as a social host in acting to intervene in specific situations, and also how you say something, how you actually go about intervening.
And one last thing in general is that this program has been adapted from the Badass general training that we do, and so we're going to be focusing on the three main prongs of that program, which are preventing sexual and relationship violence, promoting an inclusive community, and responding to people in distress, but except for adapting those sort of focuses into the party context. What do you guys think of when you think of the role of a social host? What are the responsibilities?
Well, Celia, as somebody who recently graduated from CC, I think that being a social host means that you're really facilitating a lot of the CC campus, like social culture in general, since most of our social life takes place in people's homes, and especially off-campus homes. Like inviting people into your own space is the way that I think people like facilitate a lot of social life here on campus, and being a social host means that you're particularly taking on responsibility to make sure that people are having fun, and that that social life is kind of upholding the community values that we hold at CC.
Sounds like you've thought about this before.
You're right.
Yeah. And part of that is creating a safe and inclusive environment for everybody. Yeah. And also, as a social host, I guess you're kind of responsible for thinking about what the opportunities and the joys are of hosting a party, in order to help you kind of inform how you're going to create that space in your home. So it's a lot, it involves a lot more thinking and a lot more preparation than just saying, oh, we're going to throw a big party, because you got to think about the people that you're going to bring into your space, what experiences they've had in their lives, and how that informs how they interact in your space.
Totally. And in terms of being a badass active bystander, I like to think of a host as the most important part is being aware, because after all, these people are in your space, so you need to be keeping an eye out and monitoring sort of lots of different interactions that are happening all at the same time.
Yeah, and then to add on to that, it's important to have heightened awareness, even more so than you would as a community member. But then the fact that as a host, hopefully, you are always making the decision to act. It really isn't a question whether or not it's your responsibility to intervene in a situation that could be potentially harmful to your guests, versus when you're in the community, hopefully that you decide that you should act, but that might be more of a decision-making process.
All right, so let's talk about what are the goals of a party.
Well, we usually talk about 3 goals when we're thinking about creating any kind of social space, and hopefully these goals are upheld on CC campus as well. But if we're outlining our 3 major goals as consent-oriented, inclusive, and trauma-informed, then it's important to know what each of those terms mean. So to start with consent-oriented, creating a consent-oriented space means that consent is a default expectation in all of your social interpersonal interactions, and then also when it comes to all aspects of kind of the ways that people conduct themselves, and that includes substance use as well. So thinking about that consent does not only apply to sexual engagement, but also applies to dancing and any kind of touching, and whether or not you choose to drink or participate in any other kinds of substance use. The idea that the expectation is not to participate to a certain extent. The expectation is that everybody sets their own boundaries and is able to advocate for them.
And I think with the conversation around consent, we're often thinking specifically about sex and specifically about, like, for example, intervening in a party, like in the moment when someone's getting like aggressively touched or dragged into a bedroom or something like that. But to think about consent as being relevant in all levels of interactions, and therefore, like, as a host, you might need to intervene in lots of different types of interactions that might seem like not as big of a deal or something, but that are still contributing to the way people conceptualize what's okay in the space and what's not okay.
Then moving on to inclusive, creating an inclusive space means that every person in the space feels welcome and safe regardless of the intersections of their own identity. So creating an inclusive space means that you're being aware of the possible covert ways which you are setting up the space, which you are conducting yourself, and which guests are conducting themselves, which might be exclusionary to certain peoples.
Mm-hmm. And that could be based on factors of identity like race or gender or sexuality, but that could also be based on like the choice to drink or not to drink, or like previous experience with alcohol or substance abuse and trying to stay sober, that kind of thing. Like anything that contributes to how a person may or may not feel welcome in a space has to do with creating an inclusive community in general, but especially in party contexts where like social behavior is often really coded and sort of like there's a lot of implicit expectations going on. And to move on to the third goal for setting up or for what a party space is going to be like, we'll talk about trauma-informed environments and trauma-informed community. So that means that we're going to be really centering the experiences of people who have experienced trauma and like centralizing and valuing the way that they might experience triggers in the given environment, which in this case is a party. So for example, if my friend comes up to me and tells me that she's had a bad experience with someone who just entered the room and that's really making her uncomfortable, I would want to say, like, thank you so much for telling me that. Like, how can I help you feel more comfortable? What do you want to do, and how can I support you in that? Which would be like the opposite of saying, I don't get why that's a big deal, like get over it or something like that. That's kind of the norm to devalue people's experiences of trauma, and we're really trying to work against that, which is why active bystander and intervention skills are necessary, especially as a host.
So the point of kind of the intersection of these 3 goals is the fact that typically our communities, even outside of CC, so including CC, and then our parties as well, are not consent-oriented, inclusive, and trauma-informed. So creating these kinds of spaces requires actively subverting the status quo to privilege the people who have had the comfort of people who have experienced trauma, and to make sure that in those situations, like the one that Celia was just describing, we're privileging the comfort of people who are experiencing a trigger or might be prone to experiencing a trigger, instead of expecting that those people will kind of take care of themselves, and having this kind of idea of almost burdening the other people, that the expectation is that those people's comfort will be taken into consideration.
And I think that same principle applies to consent-oriented and inclusivity as well, because it's all about like being able to like be self-aware and put an idea of other people's comfort as a priority, rather than just like making assumptions about what's okay with someone else or like what type of behavior they want to engage in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it all goes back to the overarching goal of creating a safe environment that people feel comfortable in, and taking into account individuals' different experiences and different comfort levels, because, you know, who wants to throw a party where everybody at the party is uncomfortable other than you? So when we talk about setting up the space and keeping in mind consent-oriented, inclusive, and trauma-informed, what are some like practical things that we can do?
Well, one really great way to set up those kind of 3 goals is to set, first of all, your intentions with your housemates, having a conversation about what kind of roles people want to take on during the party. If there's a theme, discussing the theme and how you're going to represent it in the house, making sure that the theme is not exclusive to any group of people, and remembering that if you're kind of really questioning it or feeling like you have to justify why the theme is okay, there's a good chance that it's not okay. And then also in terms of talking with your housemates, once you kind of like decide on the kind of core bases of how the way that you want your party, what you want your party to look like, making sure that that's communicated with people who might be coming. So one thing that we've been hearing people are doing is to set intentions on like a Facebook event page, where you can have, you know, the regular like whatever's going on, the description of the theme, or, you know, promotional whatever, and then have your kind of consent-oriented, inclusive, trauma-informed intention at the bottom, so that people are understanding that that's an expectation before they're even entering the house. Another thing that people have been doing is Celia made posters at the beginning of this year that allow you to put the names of the people who live in the house on a poster with some crisis resources and your own numbers, if you want to put your numbers there too, so that when people are in the home, they know who to contact if something is going wrong. So then that one allows you to be able to take action, even if you don't have an eye on this specific incident. But then 2, even if nobody actually reaches out to ask you for help, it again sets the intention that you are wanting people to feel comfortable and safe and willing to actively kind of be accountable for the things that are going on in your home.
Yeah, because I feel like part of why why harmful behaviors are more likely to occur in party contexts is because people have sort of a sense of anonymity when they're entering those spaces, and so having something like the host ID poster up in your bathroom helps to sort of just counteract the anonymity of being in a party setting, and for people to sort of be reminded, even if subconsciously, that they do have accountability and responsibility as a guest as well as if you're a host.
And I think it's especially important if you're going to be inviting strangers or people you don't know very well into your house. And then along with, putting up your contact information on a poster, you can also make an effort to reach out and meet those people. So you kind of get to know them a little bit and they kind of get to know you a little bit, and hopefully would feel comfortable in contacting you if they have an issue that arises in your house.
So in terms of other things you might do to set up the space, more like explicitly, having water out, or at least cups or glasses that are easily accessible for people to help themselves to water is important. Maybe having snacks. We realize that not a ton of CC parties have snacks, but who doesn't love snacks?
And also making sure you have non-alcoholic beverages, and that's partly because it's not necessarily super healthy to be drinking alcohol only the entire night. So you might want to do that for guests who are using alcohol to allow them to switch up their beverages: alcoholic, non-alcoholic, alcoholic, non-alcoholic. Could be a good strategy to kind of pace yourself, but also because having non-alcoholic beverages is inclusive to the many CC students who choose not to drink but do like to socialize in a party environment, and also students who might be in that environment who are in recovery. A lot of times we hear that students who don't drink sometimes feel awkward at parties, or feel like they're singled out, or everyone's going to notice that they're not drinking. So being able to provide them with like a soda or something where people don't necessarily know that they're being sober, or will try and stigmatize them for being sober, is being inclusive to those people too.
But at the same time, we don't want the only way for sober people to feel validated to be by hiding the fact that they're not drinking. So maybe like in your inclusivity message on Facebook, you could include something like people who don't want to drink are also welcome in the space, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And then in terms of other ways to physically set up the space to make sure that you're kind of thinking about those three goals, is even just to make sure that areas of the house that are kind of like off the main spaces are closed off. There's no places that people are being or like would have the potential to be really isolated, and that if there are those spaces and it's kind of impossible to block them off, that you are communicating with your housemates to be checking on those spaces. And same thing even just goes for lighting, making sure that there's adequate light in anywhere that people would be, like that partygoers would be. So other things to think about.
We can talk about, once your party's underway, like the types of things you might need to do to keep your party under control, or to keep it within the realm of like what you and your housemates are hoping to get out of it. And then after that, like what can you do if you need to maybe steer it in a different direction?
So I think like an important standard to talk about with your housemates beforehand is how many people you're really wanting to allow into your home. Because I think one of the biggest problems we hear about parties getting out of control on campus is overcrowding. And how might you combat overcrowding in a party space?
Well, I think that turning off the lights or just turning down the music is a great way to get a bunch of people to leave all at once. Someone was saying the other day, well, what if you want to kick some people out, but you don't want the party to be over? That was a good question, I thought. And in that case, maybe you can just like give your friends or your like closer friends who you want to stick around a heads up that you're going to be trying to clear people out, but that they should stay, and then do that tactic where you call campus safety, or turn off the light, or turn on the lights, turn off the music, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the biggest way to get people to leave is just to call campus safety, especially, you should always be registering your parties because there's a very high likelihood of getting into some trouble with the school if you don't register, and a pretty low likelihood for the most part if you do. So as long as you do register, campus safety is a really great resource to just call, and they won't go into the house, but they'll, show up with their car and come out on the lawn and just help in trying to get people to leave. And especially if you are in a situation where you have a lot of people you don't know and you want the people to stick around that you do know, the odds are that kind of separation at that point will just happen pretty naturally, and then once campus safety leaves, you'll be left with a much smaller group of people that you do know.
Same thing where if your party's getting overcrowded, or if you just are thinking like, okay, this is good, like we don't need any more people to come in, then you can turn people away at the door, which doesn't have to be like confrontational or rude. You can just say something like, hey, we're like pretty at capacity in here right now, but I'm glad you're here, like come back in 15 minutes or something like that. That way you're still like letting people know that they're welcome, but it's just a matter of safety and your responsibility to keep an eye on things for why they can't come in at this moment.
Yeah, and if you get pushback in those situations, remember not to be afraid to enforce those standards. You have those standards for a reason. And once you get a little bit of pushback and you allow a little leeway, it becomes maybe easier for people to give you some pushback and expect some leeway. So really holding to those standards and enforcing them in your own way, knowing your right that you have for renting or owning the property, whatever it is important too.
Yeah, remembering the fact that your home is your home, and students all should obviously, if you're trying to create an inclusive party, you shouldn't be excluding people. But with that being said, nobody is just entitled to be in your home. You are allowed to set your own behavioral standards, and if you feel that somebody is violating those, or that you're at capacity and there's a safety standard at risk, that you are allowed, are very much within your rights to ask that people either leave or don't come in the first place. Again, just no one is entitled to come into your home.
Mm-hmm. All right, why don't we talk about some behaviors that we would want to keep out of our spaces?
Well, when I think about what it was like to be at parties at CC, and a lot of what I saw, especially like at parties that had a sort of crowded dance floor, there was a lot of sexually predatory, overly touchy, kind of not super consensual stuff going on the dance floor. So that could be like cornering somebody or isolating somebody, hand on stomach, hand on hip, hand anywhere if the person is not looking, the recipient of that touch isn't looking comfortable.
I think when we say not super consensual, we
Not
mean
consensual.
not consensual, and meaning that it falls on that spectrum that is gender violence, and therefore would, be a predatory behavior.
Absolutely.
And then I think on top of that too, like kind of falling into, like overtly those like kind of predatory behaviors, and then just even like language that people are using, and that can be instigative of predatory behaviors or sexually violent behaviors, and it can also be really exclusionary and kind of creating a problem in terms of trying to create an inclusive space. So recognizing or keeping an ear out for the ways that your guests are speaking to and about other people.
Mm-hmm. Whether that's about women or non-binary folks or people of a certain race or any certain background, like making jokes or any type of commentary about people's belongingness or making assumptions about them contributes on the spectrum of violence that allows like more intense and harmful or maybe like physically threatening things to occur.
And we talked a little bit about people not looking comfortable. Now, what are some things that we can look out for that would indicate to us that somebody's not comfortable with a certain situation or was harmed by a certain situation?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times when we think about consent, we think about our language and verbal language, and those things are important. So obviously, if somebody initiates some sort of like kind of physical or sexual contact without asking, that's not consensual. If the person verbally says no or something that indicates they don't like that behavior, that's not consensual. But those kinds of less intense violence can show up in a lot of ways that are more covert, even such as somebody initiating that kind of contact and then the behavior of the recipient showing with their body language that they're visibly uncomfortable. So that a lot of times looks like a really stiff body, which also is definitely a sign of somebody experiencing being triggered. We know that in terms of trauma, the freeze response is really typical. So seeing somebody who is in a situation where they're being touched in a way they might not like, and maybe they aren't actively moving away or actively speaking up, but their body is really stiff and they don't really seem to be moving much at all. Their face looks like they're maybe awkward or stressed or just not really emoting much of anything, is a pretty clear sign that they might not like what's going on.
And I always think of like awkward or apprehensive laughter also as a sign that someone is uncomfortable, whether that's like from touch or physical contact or from a joke that's made or something, because there's so much pressure to go along with this kind of stuff, or like you're in freeze mode, so you're not even able necessarily to realize how not okay it is. So you might be kind of, like awkwardly laughing or smiling or something, but like as compassionate people, we should be able to recognize that as discomfort, even though the person's quote laughing or quote smiling.
Yeah.
Another behavior to look out for that might elicit concern is extreme intoxication, or even if it's not extreme intoxication, just certain behaviors around drinking that seem concerning or problematic.
Right, especially, if you notice somebody that's very drunk and say they're drinking much, much more in excess, maybe taking shots or something like that. You got to understand that that person's BAC is it could be climbing already, and then when they're taking in more and more alcohol, within 30 minutes to an hour, that BAC could climb to a point where it could get dangerous. So when it comes to drinking, we actually have these handy blood alcohol content charts in the Wellness Resource Center that you can grab and even keep around your party setting. And what those charts are is it kind of shows you what your BAC is, and just for reference, the legal limit for BAC to drive is 0.08. We don't recommend anybody driving after any sort of alcohol consumption. You can get a DWI after 0.05. So, BAC ranges, right, from 0.00, which is no alcohol in the system, to, as high as 0.25, 0.3. When we get that high, that's lethal. That's when lethal consequences can occur. So, it's not, these charts aren't a perfect science. They kind of tell you for, how much you weigh, because weight is a factor in how your body processes alcohol, and what your sex is, because the hormones that males and females have will also determine how your body processes alcohol. Based on those two factors over time, how X number of drinks is going to affect you. So if you're interested in having your guests be knowledgeable in how to pace themselves, that might be a good thing to have lying around. And so when we talk about what it looks like to be in to be in that danger zone of potential lethal consequences, 0.25, 0.3 BAC, where we might see people who are very clammy and very pale. They might lose consciousness, and it's important to understand the difference between somebody who's sleeping and somebody who's unconscious. You might hear a lot of people say, oh, that person's really drunk, just let them sleep it off. But if nobody's watching that person and making sure that they're really sleeping rather than falling unconscious, we could get in a situation where that person is not getting the medical attention that they need. So loss of consciousness, you won't be able to wake that person up. They'll also probably have very irregular and shallow breathing. They'll probably be snoring with their mouth wide open. That's the brain trying to, the brain starving for oxygen, trying to get as much oxygen in as possible. You might also, before you get to that phase, encounter uncontrollable vomiting. So all signs that you should call, not just Campus Safety. I mean, Campus Safety is a good resource. They have CC EMS on call who knows what to do in those situations, but even potentially the emergency number, 911. Yeah.
And I think in terms of intoxication and other, intoxication, exclusionary behavior, any type of sexual aggression or anything, there's kind of this uniting theme of peer pressure in a party context where there are sort of, going back to that anonymity thing and these expectations that people might have entering the space that can be really harmful or toxic. And what we want to promote is that everybody is engaging in the space on their own terms, whether that's with regards to potential sexual encounters or with how much they're drinking, if at all. All of this stuff, we want to be making space for people to express themselves and to act of their own accord, and peer pressure therefore is a behavior to look out for, because that would make people feel uncomfortable engaging in whatever way they might want to.
All right, so now we'll move on to the different styles of intervention, and we talk a lot about the 3 Ds: direct, distract, and delegate. And so not everybody's going to feel comfortable being very direct in a situation or delegating in a situation. But before we go through these, it's important to know that everyone has their own style and everyone has their own comfortability with certain situations and how they will address them. But as a social host, and creating a space that's consent-oriented, inclusive, and trauma-informed, it's your responsibility to intervene in some capacity to uphold the standards that you're laying down and the standards of the CC community.
And that being said, too, I would encourage everybody to really take time to talk about, 1, these things with their housemates, and 2, just to think about on their own terms. First of all, just what am I most comfortable with in general in terms of intervention, but then also how does my positionality affect what I'm in general most comfortable with, and how will my positionality and my relative positionality change the style that I might use. So for me and my position as a woman, for example, I am typically a person who feels pretty direct, confronting potentially harmful situations in general. But if I'm watching a confrontation between 2 men, I might feel more intimidated and therefore rely on another form of intervention. So thinking about the way that those different contexts will influence the style by which we might intervene.
So to jump into some examples of those different types of intervention, direct intervention might look like calling someone out for something they said, whether that's directly harmful to the person they said it to, or they said it to a friend about somebody else, but it's still, contributing to this spectrum of violence and of exclusivity. Or another example would be cutting someone off if you've been noticing that they've been drinking a lot and they're going in for another drink or something like that.
Exactly, and I think it's important to point out that just because you're using a direct intervention doesn't mean that it has to be confrontational. So like in the example that Celia just used in terms of cutting somebody off if they've had too much to drink, we can use refusal language that is kind of soft and uses I feel statements, or centralizes that your interest in the person's well-being. Like for example, I'm really worried that you already seem pretty drunk and I don't feel like drinking more anyway. Do you really want to? Let's go do this. And that's still directly intervening because you're approaching the situation head on. You're explaining why the situation could be potentially harmful, but you're still kind of using language that is maybe limiting the odds that the other person is going to get defensive or that the situation will escalate.
Exactly. So like in any type of intervention, you want to be addressing the behavior, not making like character judgments about the person who is committing the behavior. Because like Montana said, if you're being more confrontational or like putting it more on them as a person, then they're more likely to get defensive, which is less conducive to them reflecting on the behavior or making any types of change going forward. So yeah, whether it's direct or one of the other tactics, distract or delegate, it's important to remember to to be nice as you're going about it and to act out of concern and care for other members of the community.
Yeah. So then to move on to the next D, distract, a situation just basically in which instead of directly addressing the potential harm, you are distracting one or both or whoever is involved in a way that kind of prevents that harm, hopefully preemptively, from happening. So for example, if you were witnessing a potentially predatory situation in which one person seem to be maybe like following another person around the party or looking like they might like initiate contact in a predatory way with another person, you could distract them by saying like, hey, can I come talk to you over here? Or hey, look at like this thing that's going on outside, or what have you. But getting that person's attention and distracting it from the object the target of the behavior.
And then when we talk about delegate, we're really talking about asking, for help from housemates or other friends who might feel comfortable, potentially more comfortable than you in dealing with the situation, to help out. So that could look like, for example, if you see somebody leaving the party with, let's say, somebody that they don't know very well, and maybe they're both really intoxicated, and you're concerned about what might happen next. A good way to address that through delegation could be to, let's say, find a friend of one of those people and kind of ask them what the situation is, and perhaps that person can go and talk to somebody who's being led away, or talk to the other party, and intervene in that way if you don't feel comfortable because you don't know them. Another way to delegate is just to be aware of and use your resources like campus safety, CCEMS, even the sexual assault response coordinator on call or the counselor on call. If you feel that there's a situation that's beyond your capacity or your knowledge in the knowledge you have in helping, don't be afraid to reach out to the professional resources who are trained to help in those ways.
Yeah, and then remembering that we can always use a combination of these 3 styles as well. So maybe you distract and delegate somebody else to directly intervene or what have you.
Yeah, and to bring it back to the positionality thing that Montana was talking about at the beginning of this section, your positionality might determine like which tactic you use in which situation, but it's also important just in general to consider your biases or just how you're operating in the space as a result of different parts of your identity, like the fact that you're maybe in your own home or in an environment that is unfamiliar to you, or you're an upperclassman or an underclassman, your race, your gender, your sexuality, like all these things are determining how we're experiencing a space, and so you might feel more inclined towards one tactic based on one of those things, but also you should interrogate your own decision-making process and sort of check yourself to think about why you're making the decisions you're making about how to react to a situation, especially if you've been drinking and your decision-making process is maybe affected by that. And at the same time, kind of the flip side of the bias thing is that we, as a result of living in a society where violence is patterned according to factors like gender and race, we're inclined to make assumptions about who would be the perpetrator versus the victim of violence, but that doesn't mean that violence can occur in ways that defies those stereotypes. So we should be aware that, for example, a woman might be a perpetrator of violence, and unfortunately we might be less likely to catch that or to observe that because of our assumptions about who would be a perpetrator. So just trying to be aware as a host of those types of things and countering them in your perceptions is an important part of being an active bystander.
So we have a couple scenarios that we're going to go through and just kind of discuss how we would intervene. So the first one is your party's been going on for about an hour, and all of a sudden it seems like the number of people there doubled in size. You thought you were keeping an eye on who was coming in, but you no longer recognize much of the crowd, and it has become hard to move through the house. So what can you do to reduce the number of people in your home, and what if people aren't really listening?
Well, I'd probably first try just turning off the lights, turning down the music, seeing if that helps clear people out. But if they were still lingering around, I might give Campus Safety a call.
Yeah, especially if people aren't listening or responding to like the change in environment. Campus Safety is always a good fallback.
Mm-hmm. I would say maybe not even a fallback, like they're just there to help, so if you feel like you should call them, just give them a call.
I agree.
We're all on the same page.
Surprise, surprise. Okay. Scenario 2. You are making your rounds through the dance floor to make sure that everyone is having fun when you notice an interaction that makes you wonder. You notice Frankie, someone you had in your FYE class but don't know very well, approach Sam on the dance floor, someone you also don't know very well. Sam had been dancing with friends when Frankie began to put their hand firmly on Sam's stomach from behind, and you notice Sam's facial expression, giving an awkward smile to their friends. Frankie and Sam continue to dance. Have you noticed something like this before? What was your thought process? Are you concerned for either Sam or Frankie? And how, if at all, do you respond?
Well, personally, I have noticed something like this many times. And if I was a bystander, something that I often would do would be just to like try and initiate eye contact with Sam. Let me just make sure I have the roles correct. Yeah, with Sam. And maybe through that eye contact, like communicate that I'm like watching out for them, and then maybe like go up and say, hey, are you okay? Or like, hey, you good? Something that's kind of subtle, or maybe say something like, hey, you want to go outside for a sec? Like give Sam the option to leave the situation if they want to. Because based on something like this, they might be okay with it. We don't exactly know. But just checking in that way and continuing to observe.
Yeah, I think checking in with Sam is definitely important. And you could also kind of use that connection. Let's say you know Frankie a little bit better because they're in your FYE class. You could use that connection to distract Frankie and kind of separate them, and then talk to Sam's friends and see, if they talk to Sam, make sure everything is okay, and if things are not, how do we manipulate the environment so that there's not that uncomfortability for Sam.
And an example maybe of delegation in combination with distraction would be to maybe get a couple other friends on board to sort of surround them and start dancing, also to sort of decentralize Sam or Frankie's specific behavior towards Sam and sort of create more of a little group dance environment or something like that.
Yeah.
All right, so third scenario. A couple hours into your party, you notice there's a group of partygoers standing around in a circle shouting, chug, 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 while the one in the middle is finishing the remaining contents of a liquor bottle. You recognize this person as someone who has been drinking steadily all night. When they finish the liquor bottle, the others cheer louder, though you notice the person looks dazed, unsteady, and is becoming pale. How would you respond, and how would you address the behaviors of the other partygoers?
Yeah, so you have to assume that this person was probably drunk before they drank all of that liquor from what you've observed. So their BAC is probably just going to keep climbing and climbing and climbing. And what we hear in a lot of the sessions from students is you might want to encourage that person to puke, get all of that liquor out of their system, and then drink a lot of water, because if they're dazed and unsteady and becoming pale, you don't know where their BAC is at, and it could easily turn to lethal BAC.
And whether or not that person is able to expel the alcohol they have just consumed, you're going to want to be keeping an eye on them, like not just getting them a ride, for example, like calling safe ride, but making sure they have a sober person who's sticking with them for probably the next hour or two, if this is the case, and if they've consumed this much alcohol, making sure they don't fall asleep, because people are at risk of becoming unconscious when they've had this much alcohol. And then in terms of addressing the behavior of the other partygoers, I would bring it back to the language of not necessarily villainizing the people, but focusing on their behavior and talking about how their behavior is harmful to someone who's presumably their friend from this situation, and how the way that they were treating their friend is not in their friend's best interest, and so that's not really a very nice way to act.
Yeah, well said. All right, so during the end of the presentation, we also just want to remind you all of the resources: campus safety, the emergency number, the non-emergency number, the SARC advocate on call, counselor on call, party registration form. So that form can be found right in the Pathfinder, very accessible on the CC website. And like we mentioned earlier, the party registration form is important if you're going to be registering a party, and will likely help you avoid any potential harmful consequences from the university, and mainly that's because campus safety has the opportunity to come in, check in with you, check in with the party, and hopefully provide you with any support that you would need in the moment.
Mm-hmm. And just to make a couple more notes about these resources, the SARC advocate on call and the counselor on call are both confidential resources. So, if you need to talk about a certain situation that happened, or to need help deciding how to proceed with following up on a situation, but don't necessarily want there to be disciplinary or like official, in quotes, repercussions, then those are good resources. And just to reiterate that, like, these are all phone numbers that you can call in the moment if you're confronting a situation, but also like if it's the next day or even a week or more later and you kind of are thinking back over something and it gives you just like a gut feeling that something that happened really wasn't okay, these are also resources that you can use to follow up with things that aren't necessarily happening in the moment. All right. For listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening. And so again, my name is Chris Walters from the Wellness Resource Center.
And I'm Celia.
And I'm Montana.
All right, so you'll probably have a couple of quiz questions to do about this video in order to complete the off-campus training requirements. But we thank you for listening and hope you tune in next time.